My name is Chelsea Morris, and I am 28 years old. 30 minutes before my older brother was supposed to walk down the aisle, my mother pinned me against a mahogany vanity. She held a pair of heavy steel floral shears inches from my face. "Sign the trust transfer now, Chelsea," she rasped. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with red, and darting toward the heavy oak door she had just locked. "Or I will shred every single floral arrangement you spent the last 6 months building." She thought she had me trapped in that bridal suite. She did not know that 3 feet away, hiding perfectly still behind a silk dressing screen, the bride was listening to every desperate threat. And my mother certainly did not know that I had already woven my retaliation into the very fabric of the reception tables waiting outside. If you have ever had your boundaries pushed to the breaking point by the people who are supposed to protect you, welcome to Savage Revenge Stories. Please take a second to hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments how old you were when you finally learned to stand up for yourself. Now, let me tell you what happens when the golden child's facade cracks and the scapegoat finally stops playing nice. The cold metal of those shears reflected the vanity lights, catching the rapid pulse beating in my mother's neck. The air in that dressing room felt thick, suffocating under the scent of crushed eucalyptus, expensive hairspray, and raw panic. Diane tightened her grip on the handles. Her knuckles turned bone white. She was not acting with her usual practiced country club arrogance. This was unfiltered desperation. She was a trapped animal, and her target was the cascading white moth orchid arrangement resting on the marble counter behind me. Those flowers were my magnum opus, the centerpiece of my event design business portfolio, and she knew exactly how much they meant to my livelihood. "Sign the trust transfer now. Chelsea," she hissed again. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. "Just sign the paper." I looked at the trembling blades. The meticulously applied makeup could not hide the deep, exhausted lines around her mouth or the way her silver gown seemed to hang off her suddenly frail frame. For 28 years, my mother had ruled our Kentucky household with a polite iron fist. She cared about status, the perfect holiday cards, the perception of generational wealth. To see her standing here, threatening a bouquet of flowers like a cornered thug, sent a cold shiver down my spine. The trust she wanted me to sign away contained $250,000. It was left to me by my grandfather Thomas. It was my money, my shield, my future, and she wanted me to hand it over to Tyler. I glanced toward the corner of the room. The silk dressing screen stood motionless, but I saw the slight, unmistakable shadow of a gown cast against the patterned wallpaper. Lauren, the bride, was there. She had stepped behind the partition to adjust her corset lace just before my mother barged in. My mother had no idea we had an audience. "Mom," I kept my voice low, measuring each syllable carefully to keep the situation from escalating. "Put the shears down." She took a step closer. The silver blades hovered inches from a pristine white petal. "You have always been selfish," she spat, her voice trembling with a toxic mix of fury and fear. "Tyler needs this. He is building a legacy. You are just a florist. You owe this family." I watched a bead of sweat trace down her temple. I needed to protect the flowers, but more importantly, I needed to buy the time required for my trap to spring during the reception. I let my shoulders drop. I looked down at the vanity, feigning total defeat. I needed her to believe she had won, just for a few more hours. "Fine," I whispered, letting my voice crack just enough to sound broken. "I will sign it, but I do not have the legal papers on me. I will sign them immediately after the ceremony." Diane froze. The frantic energy drained from her body in an instant. She collapsed into a velvet chair, letting the shears clatter onto the marble countertop. She covered her face with her trembling hands, weeping in sudden, ragged relief. The sound was guttural. It was not the reaction of a calculating thief securing a payday. It was a flash of genuine, pathetic vulnerability. Watching her sob, her carefully pinned hair coming undone, a crucial question hammered in my mind. What on earth is she so terrified of? To understand how my mother ended up holding my livelihood hostage 30 minutes before a society wedding, you have to understand the dynamic that brought us to this dressing room. I have spent the last 5 years building a premium event design studio. I built it from the ground up, carrying heavy buckets of water and bleaching floral containers until my hands bled, with zero financial help from my parents. My grandfather Thomas respected that kind of grit. He saw past the polite smiles my family wore. I was the one who drove to his farmhouse every Sunday, brought him groceries, and listened to his stories while everyone else was busy networking at golf tournaments. Before he passed away, he fortified my inheritance. His lifelong attorney, Gregory Sterling, drafted the trust specifically so Diane could not touch it. Grandfather knew her history of mismanaging funds to keep up appearances, and he wanted to ensure I was safe from her financial drain. Then there is Tyler. My 32-year-old brother is the definition of the golden child. Tyler is handsome, charismatic, and perpetually launching tech startups that never seem to actually launch. To the outside world, he is a visionary entrepreneur. Inside the family, he is a black hole for cash. The uneasy peace in our house relied entirely on my willingness to act as the shock absorber for Tyler's failures. If he needed rent money for his luxury apartment, Diane would suggest I cover my own car insurance for a few months to help the family. If his latest venture went under, I was expected to smile and listen to him talk about his next big idea at Sunday dinner. I learned early on to stay quiet, keep my head down, and focus on my work. That fragile balance shattered the moment he got engaged to Lauren. Lauren was not just a bourbon heiress. She was sharp, pragmatic, and demanded excellence in every aspect of her life. Tyler played the role of an equal to her family wealth, a dangerous charade that accelerated the financial bleed in our family to a critical level. I started noticing the dangerous cracks in his facade about a year ago. The maxed-out credit cards casually left on the granite kitchen counter, the urgent, panicked whispers between him and Diane in the hallways, the way he would go out of his way to belittle my business in front of his future in-laws, desperately trying to assert his dominance and secure his image as the successful, wealthy son. Lauren's old money expectations were pushing Tyler into reckless territory. He needed a lavish wedding. He needed a down payment on a sprawling estate to match her lifestyle. He needed a 6-figure income to maintain the illusion. And my mother, who had secretly blown through the cash portion of grandfather's estate, bailing out Tyler's previous business, realized she could not foot the bill this time. She needed a new funding source. She needed my money. The pressure campaign started subtly. Diane would drop hints about how expensive the catering was getting. She would sigh loudly while reviewing floral quotes, eyeing me as if waiting for me to offer my services for free, which I did out of a misplaced sense of duty. But free flowers were not enough to plug the holes in Tyler's sinking ship. 6 months before the wedding, Diane walked into my design studio. The brass bell above the door chimed, and she stepped over the scattered eucalyptus leaves in her designer heels, her nose wrinkled in distaste. She did not ask how my business was doing. She did not ask how I was feeling. She simply pulled a folded piece of paper from her leather purse and placed it on my drafting table. It was a printed spreadsheet of Tyler's wedding expenses. "Your brother is drowning, Chelsea," she said. Her tone dripped with manufactured pity, the exact voice she used when convincing board members to donate to her charities. "He needs $75,000 to cover the catering and the deposit on his new house. We need to access your grandfather's account." I stared at the spreadsheet, noting her calculated phrasing. "We need to access your account." I set down my pruning shears and wiped my hands on my canvas apron. "No, Mom," I said. "That money is in a locked trust. It is for my future. I am saving to buy a larger warehouse space for my studio." Diane's eyes went cold. The concerned mother act vanished, replaced by a rigid glare. "You are a single event planner," she snapped. Tyler is starting a legacy. Do not be a selfish brat. You owe him this. I held my ground, meeting her gaze. I owe him nothing. She stared at me for a long moment, breathing heavily. Then she turned around and stormed out of the studio. On her way out, her purse caught the edge of a display stand. A crystal vase hit the concrete floor, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. She did not look back. She did not apologize. She just walked out to her car and drove away. That was the first time I realized she was not just asking, she was demanding. And if I could not be persuaded with guilt, she was going to use force. What I did not know at the time was that Diane had already promised the money to Tyler. She had painted herself into a corner, and the closer the wedding day loomed, the more desperate she became. Her desperation was a symptom, but I had yet to discover the disease. I had yet to discover the real, terrifying secret Tyler was holding over her head. I swept up the shattered crystal from my studio floor. Each sharp piece scraping against the concrete felt like a harsh reminder of the invisible war raging in my family. The vase had been a treasured gift from my grandfather Thomas. He bought it at a dusty estate sale years ago, placing it in my hands and telling me it was sturdy enough to hold the wildest floral arrangements I could ever dream up. Thomas was a man who understood the fundamental value of hard work. He built his wealth pulling rocks out of Kentucky soil, investing in timber and farmland, while my parents wasted their time and credit trying to buy their way into the Lexington social elite. My grandfather had rough, calloused hands and a sharp, calculating mind that saw right through my mother's polished veneer. He knew her obsession with keeping up appearances was a disease, and he took deliberate steps to ensure I would never catch it. I remember the exact day the battle lines were officially drawn. It was a rainy Tuesday 2 years ago, inside the imposing, mahogany-paneled office of Gregory Sterling. Gregory was my grandfather's lifelong attorney. He was a formidable man with thinning silver hair, bespoke suits, and a piercing gaze that routinely made liars stutter. The office smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and quiet authority. My mother sat in a tufted leather wingback chair, wearing black designer morning clothes. She kept tapping her manicured nails against her leather purse. She expected the reading of the will to be a swift, unquestioned transfer of power. She expected a blank check to fund the country club dues, the luxury car leases, and most importantly, my brother's endless business ventures. Gregory adjusted his reading glasses. He handed Diane a thin stack of papers outlining the transfer of the primary residential estate. She smiled warmly, her eyes already calculating how fast she could liquidate the assets. Then, Gregory turned his attention to me. He slid a thick, blue bonded folder across the polished desk. Thomas left explicit instructions for your portion. Chelsea, he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a judge reading a verdict. A sum of $250,000 has been placed into an irrevocable trust in your name. Diane stopped tapping her nails. The silence in the office grew heavy, thick with sudden tension. She leaned forward, the leather chair squeaking in loud protest. A trust, she repeated, the word tasting sour in her mouth. Why a trust? Thomas wanted to ensure Chelsea had a secure foundation for her growing business. Gregory replied smoothly. He did not break eye contact with her, and he wanted to ensure the principal remained entirely untouchable by anyone other than the intended beneficiary. Gregory placed heavy emphasis on the word anyone. My mother tightened her jaw. Her polite smile stretched so thin it looked painful. She knew exactly what Gregory meant. Years earlier, she had quietly drained a small college fund meant for me to cover the down payment on a European sports car for Tyler. Grandfather Thomas found out. He never yelled, but he never forgot either. The trust was his final act of protection. It was a financial fortress designed with ironclad legal stipulations that prevented me from transferring the funds under duress or manipulation. My mother stood up that day, offering forced congratulations through gritted teeth, but her eyes promised future retribution. That retribution came in the form of my older brother. 3 days after my mother shattered the crystal vase in my studio, the brass bell above my door chimed again. Tyler strolled in. He wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than my monthly studio rent, and he carried 2 expensive iced coffees. To the outside world, my 32-year-old brother was a visionary. He spoke at local business seminars, posting curated photos of himself standing in front of rented private jets and luxury real estate. Inside the walls of our home, he was a financial parasite. He had launched 3 different tech startups over the last 5 years. There was an app for luxury dog walkers, a subscription service for rare bourbon, a blockchain platform for local farmers. Each one burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars of our parents' money. And each one collapsed in a fiery heap of unpaid vendors and empty promises. Tyler set a coffee on my drafting table, flashing his trademark brilliant smile, the kind of smile he used to charm investors before losing their money. "Just checking on my favorite florist," he said, leaning his hip against the counter. "The wedding is going to be the event of the season, Chels. Lauren has photographers from 3 regional magazines coming. This exposure is going to put your little shop on the map." I kept my eyes on the delicate ranunculus stems I was trimming. My shop is already on the map. Tyler. I am fully booked for the next 2 years. He let out a patronizing chuckle. "Right, but you are playing in the minor leagues. Lauren's family knows the right people. If you deliver next weekend, you can double your prices. If you do not deliver." He let the sentence hang in the air, toxic and heavy. He took a sip of his coffee. His casual posture did not match the rigid, angry tension in his jaw. "Mom tells me you are being difficult about the trust," he said, dropping the supportive brother act entirely. I stopped trimming. I looked at him. His eyes were cold and calculating, devoid of any familial warmth. "I am not being difficult," I said, keeping my voice even. "I am just following Grandfather's wishes." Tyler scoffed, pushing off the counter. Grandpa was an old farmer who did not understand modern financial leverage. "I have a new venture, Chelsea, a logistics software that is guaranteed to secure serious venture capital by the 3rd quarter. I just need a bridge loan to cover the wedding and the new house until the funding clears. You are sitting on dead capital. It is selfish." I watched him adjust his expensive watch. I recognized it immediately. It was the same watch my mother bought him right after his last company filed for bankruptcy, a reward for his failure. "It is not a bridge loan, Tyler. You want me to hand over my future so you can pretend you are on the same level as your bride." The air between us cracked. The manufactured charm evaporated from his face, leaving behind something ugly and desperate. "You listen to me," he said, taking a step forward and invading my space. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the faint, sour scent of nervous sweat. "Lauren's parents are scrutinizing every dime I spend. If I lose face in front of them, this wedding falls apart. And if my wedding falls apart because you refuse to help your own blood, I will make sure every bride in Lexington knows you are a bitter, uncooperative amateur." He threw his half-empty coffee cup into my trash can and walked out the door, slamming behind him. My hands shook as I locked the door. Tyler was not making an idle threat. In the elite circles of Kentucky society, reputation is currency. Lauren's family wielded immense social power. If Tyler spun a narrative that I was unstable or had ruined their big day out of spite, my business would bleed elite clients faster than I could book them. I had spent countless sleepless nights building my studio. I had sacrificed holidays, relationships, and my own health to establish a name that meant quality and reliability. I was not going to let a spoiled fraud of a brother burn my life to the ground. The pressure was mounting from all sides. My mother was deploying guilt and physical intimidation. Tyler was threatening my professional survival. I knew I had to maintain the upper hand. I needed to execute the floral arrangements flawlessly, leaving no room for sabotage. while simultaneously guarding my inheritance. But the deeper I dug into the wedding preparations, the more I realized Tyler was not just faking his wealth. He was actively stealing to maintain the illusion. The golden facade was starting to crack, and the first ugly splinter appeared during a routine venue walkthrough 3 days later. The first splinter of truth revealed itself inside the grand ballroom of the Lexington Country Club. The venue was a sprawling expanse of crystal chandeliers and imported marble floors. I stood near the main entrance, sketching out the installation points for a series of suspended floral arches. Tyler walked in a few moments later, his hand resting on the lower back of his fiancée. This was my formal introduction to Lauren in a working environment. Up until that point, my mother had painted Lauren as a demanding, spoiled heiress. The reality was far more intimidating. Lauren did not wear flashy designer logos or speak loudly to command a room. She possessed the quiet, effortless confidence of old money. She wore a tailored ivory blazer and held a leather binder containing detailed vendor contracts. She was sharp, pragmatic, and missed nothing. Tyler puffed out his chest, attempting to match her natural authority. He gestured grandly toward the empty dance floor, spinning a tale about a custom lighting rig he claimed to have already secured. I watched Lauren's eyes narrow slightly. She flipped open her binder, running a manicured finger down a printed spreadsheet. "We have a slight discrepancy, Tyler," she said. Her tone was not accusatory, just analytical. "The event coordinator called me this morning. They have not received the secondary deposit for the lighting vendor. You told me that was wired on Tuesday." A muscle ticked in my brother's jaw. The polished entrepreneur routine faltered for a fraction of a second. He let out a dismissive laugh, waving his hand in the air. "It is just a banking delay, babe," he replied, his voice a pitch too high. "My primary accounts are tied up in a brief liquidity transition for the new software launch. Diane is handling the manual transfer today. Is that right, Mother?" Diane materialized from the shadows of the coat check area. Her face looked pale beneath her expensive bronzer. She nodded quickly, offering a tight, rigid smile. "Yes, of course. Just a minor routing error. It will be resolved by 5 o'clock. Lauren did not look convinced. She closed her binder with a soft snap. "I prefer transparency. Tyler, if your capital is tied up, we can utilize my family trust for the deposits. I do not want any outstanding balances hanging over our heads before the ceremony." "No," Tyler barked. The word echoed through the cavernous ballroom, sharp and defensive. He quickly softened his expression, reaching for her hand. No, that is unnecessary. The Morris family takes care of its own obligations. We are building our own legacy, remember." Lauren nodded slowly, though her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. She turned her attention toward me, offering a polite, genuine smile. "Chelsea, the floral mock-ups you sent were stunning. My mother was incredibly impressed by the cascading orchids." Before I could thank her, Tyler stepped between us, physically blocking my line of sight. "Chelsea is doing her best," he said, patting my shoulder with feigned affection. "It is a nice little hobby for her. We figured giving her the contract would be a fun way to include her in the festivities, even if her little flower shop is not quite used to this scale. Do not worry, Lauren. If she gets overwhelmed, Diane has a backup corporate vendor on speed dial." My grip tightened around my sketching pencil until the wood cracked. A nice little hobby. I was running a 6-figure design studio, employing a team of 4, and handling the most complex installations in the county. Tyler knew this. He also knew he had not paid me a single dime for the hundreds of hours I had already invested in his wedding. He was belittling my life's work to inflate his own fragile ego, using me as a prop to prove his superiority to his wealthy bride. I swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth, forcing a neutral expression. "I am fully equipped to handle the installation, Lauren," I said, keeping my voice level. "The orchids will be sourced directly from my private growers." Lauren looked at me, then at Tyler. I saw a flicker of something calculating in her eyes. It was not pity, it was suspicion. She recognized a smokescreen when she saw one. Later that afternoon, the pressure inside my mother reached a boiling point. The venue coordinator pulled Lauren away to discuss seating arrangements, leaving Tyler and Diane alone near the service corridor. I was kneeling behind a velvet curtain, measuring the base of a marble pillar, when their hushed voices drifted through the heavy fabric. "You promised me that money would be there," Tyler hissed. His tone was venomous, stripped of all its public charm. "I am trying, Tyler," Diane lispered back, her voice shaking. "My credit limit is tapped. The bank flagged the last cash advance. You have to delay the caterer." "I cannot delay the caterer," he shot back, slamming his palm against the wall. "Loren's father is playing golf with the head chef this weekend. If word gets out that my checks are bouncing, the engagement is over. They will smell the blood in the water. You need to fix this, Mom. Figure it out. Or I swear to God, I will burn this whole thing down." Footsteps marched away, leaving Diane alone in the corridor. I heard her taking ragged, uneven breaths. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from her. "Chelsea, we have a minor cash flow issue with the specialty linens. Can you put a $5,000 hold on your business card? I will pay you back on Monday. Please, it is for your brother." I stared at the glowing screen. This was my role in the Morris family ecosystem. I was the silent shock absorber. Whenever Tyler crashed his life into a wall, I was expected to throw my own body in front of the wreckage to cushion the blow. I was supposed to sacrifice my business capital to protect his illusion of success. For years, I had paid the small debts, covered the family dinners, and kept the peace to avoid Diane's wrath. But $5,000 was not a minor issue. It was the operating budget for my studio for the entire month. The psychological toll of carrying their secrets was becoming a physical weight on my chest. I felt like I was suffocating under the fabric of their lies. I typed a single word in response. No. The fallout from that two-letter word was immediate. Diane treated me like a ghost for the rest of the week. When I visited the family house for Sunday dinner, my father, Richard, refused to look me in the eye. Richard was a man who preferred a quiet life above all else. He knew his wife was enabling a monster, but he chose willful ignorance over conflict. He sat at the head of the dining table, chewing his steak in silence, while Diane made pointed, icy comments about the importance of family loyalty and the tragic nature of selfish children. Tyler sat across from me, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. He looked entirely unbothered. He had found the money for the linens elsewhere. I did not know how, and I did not want to ask. His smug satisfaction made my stomach turn. He was playing a high-stakes game of financial roulette, using Lauren's trust and our family's remaining credit as poker chips. Lauren's expectations were forcing him to maintain a lifestyle he could not afford. She expected transparency, luxury, and peer-level status. Tyler was desperate to deliver all three. He was leasing sports cars, booking private tasting menus, and ordering custom-tailored suits, all while drowning in a sea of hidden debt. The tension radiating off him was palpable. He was a man walking on a tightrope made of razor wire, and the wind was starting to blow. I thought the worst he could do was drain my parents' retirement accounts. I thought his reckless behavior was limited to maxed-out credit cards and bouncing checks. I assumed my mother was simply a victim of her own maternal blindness, spoiling a son who refused to grow up. I was wrong. The financial rot went much deeper than unpaid catering bills. The true scope of their desperation revealed itself on a Tuesday night, 3 months before the wedding. I had left a set of vintage brass vases in the basement of my parents' home, and I needed them for an early morning client consultation. I drove to the house well past midnight, assuming everyone would be asleep. I used my spare key, slipping through the front door as quietly as possible. The house was dark, except for a thin slice of yellow light spilling from beneath the heavy oak door of my father's study. As I tiptoed down the hallway, a harsh, guttural voice broke the silence. It was Tyler. He was not asking for a favor. He was delivering an ultimatum. And the secret I overheard him use to threaten our mother was so terrifying, it shifted the entire foundation of my reality. I stood frozen in the shadows, clutching my car keys so tightly the jagged metal bit into my palm. The house was entirely silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the hushed, frantic voices bleeding through that narrow gap in the doorway. I held my breath and crept closer. The floorboards in my parents' colonial home were notoriously creaky, but I had spent my entire childhood learning exactly where to step to remain invisible. I pressed my back against the cool plaster wall right outside the study. My mother's voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. It lacked her usual polished country club authority. It sounded thin, ragged, and steeped in sheer panic. "I cannot pull blood from a stone." "Tyler," she pleaded, her voice cracked on his name. "I maxed out the platinum card to cover the rehearsal dinner deposit. Your father is starting to ask questions about the missing funds from the joint savings. If I push Richard any harder, he will call the accountant." Tyler let out a low, humorless laugh. It was the sound of a predator playing with its food. "That is a management issue, Mother, not a capital issue. You are a resourceful woman. You just need proper motivation." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were slick with nervous sweat. Something in my brother's tone told me this was not a normal financial argument. He was not begging for a bailout. He was dictating terms. I unlocked my screen, opened the voice memo application, and tapped the bright red record button. I held the microphone close to the crack in the door. "You promised me the catering check would clear by Friday," Tyler continued, his footsteps pacing across the Persian rug inside the study. "Lauren's father wants to introduce me to his primary investors next week. If my checks bounce before that dinner, the entire wedding is compromised. I am not losing this marriage because you lack liquid assets." "I have given you everything," Diane whispered. I heard the rustle of silk as she sank into one of the leather armchairs. "Every cent of my disposable income has gone toward keeping your head above water. Your first startup, the logistics company, the luxury apartments. There is nothing left." A heavy thud echoed from the room. It sounded like a thick manila folder hitting the mahogany desk. "There is $250,000 sitting in a local branch right now," Tyler said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Chelsea does not need that kind of capital to arrange tulips. I need it for the down payment on the estate. Lauren's family expects us to close on the property before the honeymoon. She will not sign the transfer." Diane cried out, her desperation boiling over. "Gregory Sterling drafted that trust specifically to lock me out. It is ironclad. Chelsea knows I cannot force her hand." I watched the red timer on my phone screen tick upward, recording every poisonous syllable. "You will find a way to force her hand," Tyler replied smoothly, "because if you do not deliver Chelsea's trust fund to my escrow account by the end of the month, I am going to mail these copies directly to the district attorney." The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the hallway. I pressed my ear closer to the wood, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Tyler, you would not," Diane gasped. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. "I am your mother. I did that for you. Do you think the federal government cares about maternal sacrifice?" Tyler asked, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Wire fraud is a federal offense. Elder financial abuse carries mandatory minimum sentencing." My stomach plummeted. Elder financial abuse. The pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle suddenly snapped together in my mind, forming a horrifying picture. Tyler tapped his fingers against the desk. "Let us review the timeline for the sake of clarity. 4 years ago, Grandfather Thomas was lying in a hospice bed, drifting in and out of consciousness on a morphine drip. He could barely recognize his own daughter, let alone sign a legal document. Yet, somehow, his signature appeared on a second mortgage application for his farmhouse, a mortgage for $300,000. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I remembered those awful weeks in the hospice facility. I had sat by my grandfather's side every single afternoon, reading to him while his breathing grew shallow. My mother had rarely visited. She claimed she could not bear to see him suffer. Now, the sickening truth was laid bare. She was not avoiding his suffering. She was avoiding the man she was actively robbing. You needed seed money for that initial software venture. Diane sobbed, the sound muffled by her hands. The bank was threatening to repossess your car. You told me you would pay the mortgage back before he ever found out. You swore to me the company would go public. And it failed. Tyler said simply, dismissing the destruction of our grandfather's legacy with a shrug. That is the nature of business. But the fact remains that you forged a dying man's signature, secured a fraudulent notary, and wired the funds across state lines to my corporate account. You committed the felony. I was just the passive recipient of an overzealous mother's generosity. I stared at the recording app on my phone, feeling dizzy. My mother had committed a severe federal crime to fund Tyler's failed tech dream. She had stolen the equity right out from under the man who built our family. And now, the son she broke the law to protect was holding the evidence over her head like an executioner's axe. I kept the original documents. Tyler continued. The notary admits she never saw Thomas sign the paperwork. The digital trail is undeniable. If you do not break Chelsea's trust and transfer her funds to me, I will burn your life to the ground. You will lose the country club. You will lose the house. You will go to a federal penitentiary, and Richard will divorce you before the ink on your indictment is dry. You are a monster, Diane whispered, her voice devoid of any hope. I am a pragmatist, Tyler corrected. You created me, Mother. You taught me that maintaining the image of success is the only thing that matters. So, help me maintain it. Threaten Chelsea's business. Threaten her reputation. Do whatever it takes to get her signature on those release forms. I want the money by the final venue walkthrough. I hit the stop button on my phone and saved the audio file. The screen locked, plunging me back into the dark. My entire worldview shifted in that shadowy hallway. For years, I had harbored deep resentment toward my mother. I believed she was the ultimate villain of our family, a narcissistic matriarch pulling every string to feed her own vanity. But the reality was far more tragic and complex. Diane was not the mastermind. She was a hostage. She was a victim of the very monster she had spent 3 decades creating. She had spoiled Tyler, enabled his delusions, and broken the law to shield him from failure. In return, Tyler was extorting her, using her crime as leverage to steal my future. I did not wait to hear the rest of their conversation. I slipped backward, stepping silently across the floorboards until I reached the front door. I turned the brass knob with excruciating care, slipping out into the cold night air and pulling the door shut behind me. I walked quickly to my car, my legs feeling like lead. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors, but I did not start the engine right away. I just sat in the dark driveway, clutching the steering wheel, trying to process the magnitude of the weapon I now held in my pocket. Tyler was willing to send his own mother to federal prison to secure a wealthy bride. Diane was willing to destroy my floral design business to save her own skin. They were locked in a toxic, mutually assured destruction, and I was the collateral damage they intended to spend. I pulled out onto the quiet suburban street, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The digital file on my phone burned a hole in my pocket. I had the undeniable proof of their crimes. I had the leverage to stop the extortion. But the revelation brought a crushing wave of isolation. I could not go to my father, who preferred the comfort of ignorance. I could not confront Tyler alone, knowing his sociopathic capacity for ruin. I needed guidance from someone who understood the ruthless nature of the law. I needed the man who built the fortress around my inheritance in the first place. As I drove through the empty streets of Lexington, my mind raced with the terrifying implications of the secret I carried. I had to decide whether to let my mother face the consequences of her felony or step into the crossfire to stop my brother. The psychological weight of that choice threatened to crush me, but it also crystallized my resolve. I was not going to be a victim. I was going to fight back. And my first step was booking an emergency meeting with Gregory Sterling. The digital audio file on my phone felt heavier than a brick. For 3 days, I carried that secret, walking through the motions of my life while a silent storm raged inside my head. The world outside my floral studio carried on as usual. Delivery trucks dropped off pallets of imported roses. Brides called to agonize over the exact shade of blush ribbon for their bouquets. But I was operating on autopilot, haunted by the realization that the villain of my childhood was, in fact, a terrified hostage. For as long as I could remember, I viewed my mother, Diane, as a cold, calculating narcissist. She was the architect of my isolation, the woman who consistently sacrificed my needs to pave a golden road for her favorite child. I spent countless hours in therapy untangling the damage of her conditional love. I thought her recent desperation, the shattered crystal vase, the frantic demands for my trust fund, were simply the final, ugly symptoms of her greed. Now, every erratic behavior snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. The sudden weight loss, the dark circles she tried to cover with expensive concealer, the way she flinched when Tyler entered her room. She was not aggressively pushing for my inheritance because she wanted to buy him a house. She was desperately trying to buy her own freedom. She had committed a felony, forging my dying grandfather's signature to cover Tyler's early failures, and the son she broke the law to protect had turned around and strapped a financial bomb to her chest. The complexity of the situation paralyzed me. If I did nothing, Diane would likely face a federal indictment. Tyler would mail the evidence, and she would lose everything: the country club membership, the colonial house, her freedom, and whatever remained of her fragile dignity. Part of me, the wounded child who had spent decades in the shadows, felt a dark, bitter satisfaction at the thought of her facing total ruin. She made her bed, and it was lined with fraudulent mortgage papers. But then I thought about Tyler. If Diane took the fall, Tyler would walk away completely unscathed. He would marry Lauren, secure his position within her wealthy family, and continue his cycle of parasitic destruction with a brand new set of victims. He would wear his tailored suits and flash his brilliant smile, playing the tragic son whose mother made terrible mistakes, while he lived comfortably on stolen equity. I could not let him win. I could not let him destroy Grandfather Thomas's legacy and dance on the ashes. I needed a strategic perspective, someone completely detached from the emotional venom of the Morris family. I needed Gregory Sterling. I called his office early Thursday morning, requesting an emergency consultation. Gregory cleared his schedule, likely sensing the panic vibrating through my voice. When I arrived at his mahogany-paneled office, I did not offer pleasantries. I sat in the same tufted leather chair my mother had occupied 2 years earlier and placed my phone on his polished desk. I pressed play. Gregory listened to the entire recording in absolute silence. His expression remained carved from granite, but I saw the subtle tightening of his jaw when Tyler admitted to holding the forged mortgage documents. When the audio finished, the tense silence stretched between us, thick with legal implications. "Well, Chelsea," Gregory finally said, leaning back and steepling his fingers, "this is a profound complication." "Can he actually do it?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Can Tyler send her to prison?" Gregory let out a slow, measured breath. "Wire fraud and elder financial abuse are severe federal offenses. If Tyler delivers the forged notary documents and the bank transfer records to the district attorney, Diane faces a very real threat of indictment. The timeline is precarious. But the digital trail he described is usually quite damning. Your brother is holding a loaded gun." My stomach churned. "So, she is trapped." "Legally, yes," Gregory confirmed. "However, Tyler is also engaging in extortion, which is a crime in itself. The problem is mutually assured destruction. If he turns her in, she goes down. If she exposes his extortion, she still has to answer for the underlying fraud." He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. The more pressing question, Chelsea, is what you intend to do with this information. You have the power to stop the extortion by signing over the trust, or you can allow the dominoes to fall. I looked at the phone resting on the desk. Grandfather left me that money to protect me from her, I whispered. He knew she was capable of something like this. He did, Gregory agreed softly. Thomas recognized the danger of her obsession with appearances. But I assure you, he never anticipated she would commit a felony, nor did he foresee Tyler weaponizing that crime against her. I closed my eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on my chest. I could not sign over the trust. Giving Tyler that money would validate his extortion and leave me financially vulnerable, completely negating my grandfather's final wish. But walking away felt equally impossible. I am not giving Tyler the money, I stated, my voice finding a firm, undeniable resolve. But I am not going to sit back and watch him ruin her while he walks away with a wealthy bride. He needs to face consequences. He needs to be exposed. Gregory studied me for a long moment, a faint glimmer of respect warming his stern features. Exposing Tyler requires extreme caution. Chelsea, if you trigger his temper prematurely, he will send those documents to the DA out of pure spite. You need leverage that neutralizes his threat before he has the chance to execute it. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out the legal landmines. Gregory explained that the audio recording I possessed was powerful, but potentially inadmissible in a formal court setting, depending on local consent laws. However, in the court of public opinion, specifically within the tight-knit, elite circles of Kentucky society, it was a lethal weapon. Tyler's entire future relied on Lauren and her family believing he was a successful, ethical entrepreneur. As I drove back to my floral studio, the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I knew my mother deserved to face the consequences of her fraud. She stole from her own father. But Tyler was the immediate, active threat. He was a sociopath draped in designer clothing, and he was currently targeting his bride. I realized I held the key to his destruction. But I could not turn the lock alone. I needed an ally on the inside, someone positioned close enough to Tyler to blindside him completely. I needed someone who had just as much to lose if he succeeded, and just as much anger if they discovered the truth. My thoughts drifted to the crisp, intelligent woman who had challenged Tyler about the lighting deposit in the country club ballroom. Lauren was sharp, pragmatic, and demanded transparency. She was preparing to merge her life and her considerable assets with a man who was actively extorting his own family to fund their wedding. If Lauren found out who she was really marrying, she would not just leave him, she would destroy him. The only problem was getting past the formidable wall of lies Tyler had built around her. He had systematically painted our family as a group of eccentric, uncooperative burdens, isolating Lauren from any meaningful contact with me. I needed a legitimate reason to get her alone, away from his watchful eye, to present the truth. Opportunity arrived 2 days later, wrapped in a crisis of Tyler's own making. I was at the studio, finalizing the order for 300 imported white gardenias, when the front door chimed. I expected a delivery driver. Instead, Lauren walked in. She looked entirely different from the composed heiress I met at the venue. Her ivory blazer was wrinkled. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled into a messy knot. The quiet confidence was gone, replaced by a tight, vibrating anxiety. She carried her leather wedding binder, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "Chelsea," she said, her voice tight and hurried, "I am sorry to drop in unannounced. I need to review the final floral invoices. Right now." I wiped my hands on my apron, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Of course, Lauren. Is everything all right?" She walked over to my drafting table, dropping the thick binder onto the wood. It landed with a loud thud. "Everything is fine," she clipped, refusing to make eye contact. I just noticed some administrative errors in the joint wedding accounts. Several large withdrawals were made this week, and the vendors are calling me about missed payments. I need to cross-reference your deposits immediately." I looked at her trembling hands. The cracks in Tyler's golden facade had finally reached his bride. And the fallout was about to provide me with the perfect opening. The solid glass door of my studio opened, letting in a gust of warm afternoon air. The brass bell chimed, slicing through the low hum of the floral refrigerators. I wiped my damp hands on my canvas apron and stepped out from behind the design counter. I expected to see a delivery driver holding a clipboard. Instead, Lauren stood in the entryway. She looked entirely different from the composed heiress I had met in the country club ballroom. Her ivory blazer was wrinkled at the elbows, her perfectly styled hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and she was clutching her leather wedding binder tight against her chest. The quiet, effortless confidence she normally projected had vanished. In its place was a tight, vibrating anxiety that made her posture rigid. "Chelsea," she said. Her voice sounded thin and hurried. "I am sorry to drop in unannounced. I need to review the final floral invoices with you, right now." I sensed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The air in the studio grew heavy. "Of course, Lauren," I replied, keeping my tone gentle. "Is everything all right?" She walked over to my drafting table and dropped the heavy binder onto the wood. It landed with a loud thud. "Everything is fine," she clipped. She refused to make eye contact, focusing instead on a bucket of white hydrangeas near her elbow. I just noticed some administrative errors in the joint wedding accounts. Several large withdrawals were made this week, and a few vendors are calling me about missed payments. I need to cross-reference your deposits immediately to ensure you are fully compensated. I watched her hands. Her fingers were trembling slightly as she flipped open the binder. I noticed a chipped nail on her index finger, a stark contrast to her usual flawless presentation. The cracks in Tyler's golden facade had finally reached his bride. The fallout was providing me with the perfect opening, but I had to tread carefully. If I pushed too hard, her pride would take over and she would retreat. I walked over to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and flipped the sign in the window to read "Closed." I lowered the blinds. Lauren watched me perform these actions, her eyes tracking my every movement. "There are no missing deposits on my end," I said, walking back to the table. "I have not charged you or my brother a single dime for these arrangements. This was supposed to be my gift to the family." Lauren stared at me, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Tyler told me he paid you a $20,000 retainer last month. He showed me the line item in our joint spreadsheet." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Tyler had not just lied to her. He had used my business as a phantom expense to siphon $20,000 out of their shared account. He pocketed the cash and blamed the withdrawal on my floral services. "He never paid me." "Lauren," I kept my voice steady, holding her gaze. "I have been funding this entire installation out of my own operating budget." Lauren gripped the edge of the drafting table. Her knuckles turned white. She looked down at the open binder, staring at a stack of bank statements covered in red highlighter marks. She took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady herself. When she looked back up, the polite society girl mask was gone. The woman standing in front of me possessed a sharp, calculating intellect, and she had just realized she was being played. "What kind of game is your brother running, Chelsea?" she asked. Her voice dropped, losing its hurried panic and taking on a dangerous, quiet edge. I realized this was the turning point. I could protect the family secret and let her marry a parasite, or I could blow the doors wide open and forge an alliance. I chose the truth. "He is running a survival game," I replied. I pulled a wooden stool across the concrete floor and gestured for her to sit. "Tyler is broke. He has been broke for years. Every tech company he started has gone under, leaving a trail of unpaid debts. He does not have a fortune. He does not have venture capital waiting in the wings. He has been living off my parents' credit cards, and now that their accounts are tapped out, He is draining your joint funds to keep up appearances." Lauren sank onto the stool. She did not cry. She did not deny my words. Instead, her mind began working through the timeline, connecting the dots that Tyler had so carefully obscured. "He told me you were a struggling amateur," Lauren said, her eyes scanning the complex, beautiful arrangements filling my studio. "He said you were deeply jealous of his success and that you constantly begged our parents for financial bailouts. He warned me not to talk to you about money because you would try to take advantage of my family." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. It was a classic triangulation tactic. By keeping us separated and feeding us conflicting stories, Tyler ensured we would never compare notes. He turned us into adversaries before we even had a chance to speak. "He told me you were a demanding, unreasonable snob," I countered. "He said you were forcing him to buy an estate he did not want, and that your expectations were driving him into brief liquidity issues." Lauren closed her binder. A fierce, cold clarity settled over her features. "My family built a bourbon empire by identifying bad investments and cutting them loose," she said. "I demand excellence, yes, but I never demanded an estate." Tyler insisted on the sprawling property. He insisted on the private club memberships. He told me he was moving his assets around to surprise me with the deed to the house next week. The pieces of his elaborate con were falling into place. Tyler was draining Lauren's accounts to fund his daily luxury lifestyle, using the promise of a grand real estate purchase as a smokescreen. Meanwhile, he was extorting my mother to steal my trust fund, hoping to use my inheritance to actually buy the house and replace the money he stole from Lauren before she noticed. He was juggling live grenades, hoping to close the deal at the altar before they detonated. We sat in the quiet studio, surrounded by the sweet, heavy scent of gardenias and damp earth. Two women, previously kept apart by a web of calculated lies, finally seeing the reality of the man caught in the middle. "There is more," I said softly. I leaned against the counter, deciding to reveal the next layer of his desperation without exposing my mother's felony. If I told Lauren about the mortgage fraud, she might feel legally obligated to report it immediately, which would send my mother to prison before we dealt with Tyler. I needed to keep the focus on my brother. He is trying to force me to sign over my grandfather's trust fund, $250,000. He threatened to ruin my business reputation in Lexington if I refused. Lauren's eyes widened, then narrowed into a predatory squint. "He is trying to steal your inheritance to replace the funds he siphoned from me." "Exactly," I nodded. "He needs my money to cover his tracks. If he gets my signature, he buys the house, hides his theft, and marries into your family network. If he does not get my signature, the entire illusion collapses." Lauren stood up. The anxiety that had plagued her when she walked through the door was gone. It was replaced by a rigid, uncompromising fury. She did not throw a tantrum. She did not scream. She simply adjusted her blazer, her posture straightening into a pose of absolute authority. "I am not going to be a victim to a con artist," Lauren stated, "and I am certainly not going to let him steal your future to subsidize his lies." "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to trap him," she replied, her voice smooth and chilling. "I could cancel the wedding right now. I could walk away. But if I do that quietly, he will spin a story. He will tell his network that I was crazy, that I broke his heart, and he will move on to his next target. I want to burn his reputation to the ground in front of every person he respects. I want to leave him with nothing." I looked at the bride standing in my studio. She was no longer just a wealthy client. She was a strategist, a weapon, and the most dangerous ally I could have ever asked for. "I have an idea," I said, reaching into my apron pocket. I pulled out a small, printed sample of the reception menus I had designed earlier that morning. It involves the wedding day. We use his vanity against him. We let him walk right up to the altar, thinking he has won. Lauren took the sample menu from my hand, studying the elegant calligraphy. A slow, calculating smile spread across her face. Tell me everything. The air in the studio felt charged with a new, dangerous energy. The Golden Child had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed the women in his life were tools he could easily manipulate. He never anticipated that we would sharpen ourselves against his lies and strike back. The conflict was no longer a defensive struggle. It was a coordinated offensive. And the trap was about to be set. The sunlight streaming through the studio windows felt sharply at odds with the dark, calculated plan we were mapping out across my drafting table. Lauren, the composed bourbon heiress, leaned over the scattered floral sketches. Her perfectly manicured finger traced the edge of a sample menu I had printed earlier that week. "If we are going to do this," Lauren said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur, "it cannot just be a quiet breakup. I need a public detonation. I need to make sure Tyler can never spin this, never play the victim, and never pull this con on another family in our social circle." I nodded, feeling a strange surge of adrenaline. I want to protect my grandfather's trust, but more importantly, I want my mother released from the extortion. If Tyler is exposed as a fraud and a thief to the very people he is trying to impress, he loses all his leverage. Lauren tapped the heavy cardstock of the menu. We need undeniable proof, and we need to deliver it when he is most vulnerable. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the audio file I had recorded outside the study and pressed play. Tyler's arrogant, cruel voice filled the studio, outlining the forged mortgage, the stolen funds, and the explicit threat to send our mother to a federal penitentiary. Lauren listened with her eyes closed, absorbing the sheer malice in his tone. When the recording finished, she let out a slow breath. "He is a sociopath," she said flatly. "He is draining my accounts to pay for the wedding and extorting your mother to buy the estate. It is a brilliant, terrifying shell game." "We have the audio," I said, setting the phone down. "And Gregory Sterling, my grandfather's attorney, is pulling the public records on the second mortgage as we speak. We will have the digital paper trail by tomorrow." Lauren picked up the sample menu again. The calligraphy was elegant, printed on thick, textured cotton paper. At the very bottom, in small, unassuming font, was a placeholder for the catering website. "You control the visual flow of the wedding." Lauren observed, her eyes narrowing as the strategy crystallized. "You design the programs. You design the seating charts. You design these menus. Every guest will have one of these sitting right in front of them during the reception." A cold smile spread across my face. I understand where she was going. I opened a drawer and pulled out a sheet of gold foil transfers. What if we replaced the catering link with a custom QR code? Lauren leaned closer, the anxiety from earlier entirely replaced by predatory focus. What would it link to? A private, unlisted server? I replied, my mind racing through the logistics. A simple web page containing the audio file and the forged mortgage documents. A digital dossier of Tyler's crimes. "It is brilliant," Lauren whispered. "But how do we guarantee the guests will actually scan it? People usually ignore those codes, unless there is an incentive. We use his vanity against him." I said, knowing my brother's fatal flaw better than anyone. Tyler is obsessed with his image. He craves validation. We tell him the QR code links to a romantic video montage of your love story. We tell him it is a surprise presentation for the guests. A digital tribute to your relationship and his success. He will eat it up. He will practically beg people to scan it. Lauren let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was the sound of a woman reclaiming her power. "He will probably make a speech directing everyone to look at it," she agreed. "He loves an audience." We spent the next 2 hours refining the trap. The execution required absolute precision and total secrecy. Lauren would act the part of the slightly stressed but devoted bride. She would not confront him about the missing funds. She would simply transfer the remaining balances in their joint accounts back into her private family trust, leaving just enough to cover the immediate, minor expenses, so he wouldn't suspect a mass exodus. I, meanwhile, would play the compliant, beaten-down sister. I would promise my mother that I would sign the trust transfer papers right after the ceremony, ensuring she felt secure enough to proceed with the day. The most delicate part of the operation was the technology. I contacted a trusted web developer who owed me a favor for designing his own wedding flowers. I paid him in cash to set up an untraceable, secure landing page. I sent him the audio file and the scanned PDF of the fraudulent mortgage documents Gregory had procured. 3 days later, a small, heavily insured package arrived at my studio. Inside were 300 custom letterpress menus. They were stunning, minimalist and elegant, perfectly matching Lauren's aesthetic. And stamped at the bottom of each one was a brilliant gold foil QR code. I took a picture of the menu and texted it to Tyler. Added a special touch to the table settings. I wrote, keeping the tone light and accommodating. Lauren and I thought it would be sweet to include a QR code linking to a digital photo album of your relationship, a little surprise for the guests during dinner. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Tyler called. "Chels, this is actually a fantastic idea," he said. His voice was dripping with that manufactured charm. The tension from our last argument seemingly erased by this stroke of public relations genius. It adds a great modern touch. Lauren's parents will love the sentimentality. Make sure the font is legible. I want everyone scanning that code before the toasts. I will make sure it is perfect, I replied, my stomach twisting at the ease of his deception. Excellent. And Mom mentioned you are bringing the trust paperwork to the venue on Saturday. He added, seamlessly transitioning from affectionate brother to ruthless extortionist. Have the signature lines tabbed. We need to execute the transfer before cocktail hour ends. I will have it ready. I lied, my voice steady. Good girl, he said, and hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling a profound sense of isolation. The golden facade was still intact, but the foundation was rigged with dynamite. My mother was still pacing the floors of her colonial house, terrified of the federal prison sentence hanging over her head. My father was still hiding in his study, willfully blind to the rot consuming his family. The days leading up to the wedding blurred into a chaotic montage of floral deliveries, panicked vendor calls, and endless fake smiles. I felt like a double agent operating behind enemy lines. Every time I saw Tyler, he looked more smug, more assured of his victory. He bought a new tailored tuxedo. He booked a luxury suite for the wedding night. He was spending imaginary money, confident that my $250,000 trust fund would materialize just in time to cover his massive fraud. Lauren played her part flawlessly. At the rehearsal dinner, she sat beside him, smiling for the cameras, her posture relaxed and elegant. She clinked glasses with my mother, thanking her for raising such a wonderful son. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. I watched Diane accept the compliment with a tight, terrified smile, her eyes darting toward Tyler like a frightened bird. I left the rehearsal dinner early, claiming I needed to supervise the late-night installation at the venue. The grand ballroom of the Lexington estate was silent and cavernous at midnight. My team and I worked for 6 hours straight, suspending thousands of white orchids from the chandeliers and arranging the massive table centerpieces. When the installation was complete, I dismissed my crew. I stood alone in the center of the room, the rich scent of gardenias filling the cold air. I walked to the head table, draped in imported ivory silk. I picked up one of the custom menus and placed it precisely in the center of the gold charger plate. The gold foil QR code caught the dim light, gleaming like a tiny, lethal weapon. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera application, and hovered the lens over the code. A yellow link appeared on the screen. I tapped it. The private server loaded instantly. Bold, black text appeared against a stark white background. The truth about Tyler Morris. Below the heading was an embedded audio player and a link to download the forged mortgage documents. I locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket. The trap was set. The stage was dressed. All that was left was for the golden child to walk into the spotlight. The countdown to the ceremony had officially begun, and the tension in the air was absolute. Diane pulled a silk handkerchief from her clutch. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes, careful not to smear her expensive cosmetics. The frantic energy that had fueled her threat with the floral shears was entirely spent, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a woman. She believed my lie. She believed that my quiet submission meant she had successfully secured the $250,000 trust fund to pay off her extortionist son. "I will have the notary waiting in the bridal suite immediately after the recessional," Diane said. Her voice was still shaky, but the familiar, commanding tone was beginning to creep back in as she rebuilt her psychological armor. "Do not disappoint me, Chelsea. We are saving this family today." I kept my gaze fixed on the marble floor. "I will be there," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. She gave a sharp nod, picked up her leather purse, and walked to the massive oak door. The lock clicked open with a loud metallic snap. She stepped out into the bustling hallway, pulling the door shut behind her. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. I let out a long, shaky breath, leaning my hands against the vanity to steady my trembling knees. The scent of gardenias and hairspray still hung thick in the air, a cloying reminder of the conflict that had just threatened my livelihood. A soft rustle of fabric broke the quiet. The silk dressing screen in the corner of the suite shifted. Lauren stepped out into the light. She looked breathtaking. Her gown was a masterpiece of imported lace and ivory satin, fitting her perfectly. Her hair was swept into an intricate, elegant chignon. To any outside observer, she was the picture of a radiant, affluent bride preparing for the happiest moment of her life. But her eyes told a completely different story. They were cold, focused, and harder than diamonds. She had stood behind that partition in total silence, listening to my mother confess to financial ruin, listening to the desperate threats against my business, and listening to the undeniable proof that the family she was about to marry into was a collapsing house of cards. A lesser woman might have broken down into hysterical tears. A different bride might have screamed, thrown her bouquet, and called off the wedding right then and there. But Lauren was not a fragile debutante. She was the heir to a Kentucky bourbon empire. Her father had built his fortune by navigating ruthless corporate negotiations and cutting loose deceitful business partners. He taught his daughter how to read balance sheets, but more importantly, he taught her how to spot a bad investment and remove the rot without hesitation. She did not mourn the loss of her fairy tale romance because she realized the romance had never been real. Tyler was a parasite, and he had just tried to feed on her family. Lauren walked over to the vanity. She did not offer me a hug or a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Pity was useless to us right now. Instead, she picked up a tube of lipstick, uncapped it, and carefully applied a fresh coat, checking her reflection in the mirror with clinical precision. "Your mother is a terrified, broken woman," Lauren said, pressing her lips together. "And Tyler broke her. He used her crimes to turn her into a weapon against you." "He thinks he won," I replied, watching her reflection. "He thinks the money is secured and the estate is his." Lauren capped the lipstick and set it down with a sharp click. She turned to face me. Her posture was flawless, radiating an intense, lethal authority. "Are the codes live?" I reached into my apron pocket and felt the smooth surface of my smartphone. "Yes," I confirmed. "The private server is active. The audio recording of his extortion is uploaded. And the PDF files of the forged mortgage documents are linked directly below it. The moment anyone scans the gold foil square on their menu, the truth goes public." A slow, chilling smile spread across Lauren's face. It was not a smile of joy, but of calculated anticipation. "Good," she murmured. "He wants to play the visionary entrepreneur. Let us give him an audience he will never forget." We did not say another word. The understanding between us was absolute. We were no longer just the sister and the bride. We were the architects of a long overdue reckoning. A gentle knock on the door signaled that our time in the suite was up. It was the wedding planner, a frantic woman with a clipboard, informing us that the groomsmen were in position and the processional was about to begin. Lauren picked up her custom bouquet, a cascading arrangement of white peonies and trailing ivy that I had designed specifically to complement her gown. She held it with steady, unshakable hands. We walked out of the bridal suite and into the wide, carpeted hallway of the estate. The sounds of the impending ceremony drifted up from the grand staircase. A string quartet was playing a classical piece, the notes floating through the air, elegant and deceptively serene. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms hurried past us, carrying trays of champagne flutes for the upcoming reception. Everything looked perfect. Everything was a lie. As we reached the top of the stairs, my father, Richard, stepped out of a nearby study. He was wearing a classic black tuxedo, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Richard had spent his entire marriage avoiding conflict, choosing the comfort of his leather armchair over the difficult task of confronting my mother's toxic behavior. He knew Tyler was a financial drain. He knew Diane was hiding severe debts. Yet, he chose to look the other way, hoping the problems would simply vanish if he ignored them long enough. "You look beautiful, Lauren," Richard said, offering a tight, forced smile. "The guests are seated. We are ready for you down there." "Thank you, Richard," Lauren replied, her voice smooth and polite. Her ability to maintain her composure in the face of his willful ignorance was staggering. Richard turned his gaze to me. His eyes flickered with a brief, uncomfortable question. He knew Diane had cornered me in the suite. He knew what she was demanding. But true to form, he did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask if I needed help. He simply gave a curt nod, silently thanking me for not causing a scene, and hurried down the stairs to take his seat in the front row. We followed him down the sweeping staircase, stepping out onto the manicured lawn where the ceremony was taking place. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the estate. 300 chairs were arranged in perfect, symmetrical rows, filled with the wealthiest, most influential figures in Kentucky society. There were judges, real estate developers, and corporate executives, all gathered to witness the union of two prominent families. I took my place in the line of bridesmaids, standing near the floral archway I had built just hours prior. I looked down the aisle and saw Tyler waiting at the altar. He looked like a man who owned the world. His tailored tuxedo fit impeccably. His hair was perfectly styled. He stood tall, exuding an aura of total triumph. When he saw Lauren begin her walk down the aisle, his trademark brilliant smile stretched across his face. It was the smile of a con artist who believed he had just pulled off the heist of the century. As Lauren drew closer, Tyler shifted his gaze from his bride and made direct eye contact with me. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of his chin. It was a gesture of pure dominance. He was acknowledging his victory, silently gloating that he had successfully broken my mother and forced me to surrender my future. He thought I was standing there defeated, stripped of my grandfather's protection, ready to fund his lavish charade. I did not break eye contact. I kept my face entirely neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. Let him enjoy his delusion for a little while longer. Lauren reached the altar. She handed her bouquet to the maid of honor and turned to face the man she was about to destroy. Tyler reached out and took her hands, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. He leaned in and whispered something to her, likely a charming, practiced line about how beautiful she looked. Lauren did not flinch. She smiled back, a picture-perfect response that belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine. The officiant stepped forward and began to speak, his voice carrying over the silent, attentive crowd. He talked about trust, about building a foundation on honesty, and about the sacred promises that bind two people together. The bitter irony of his words hung thick in the warm air. I stood quietly, gripping the stems of my own bouquet, watching the ceremony unfold. Every vow Tyler recited was an act of perjury. Every promise he made was tethered to a stolen checkbook. He was standing on a stage built entirely from fraud, surrounded by an audience of his peers, completely oblivious to the trap door waiting beneath his feet. The snare was set. The trigger was waiting inside the grand ballroom. The listener could almost hear the countdown ticking away in the silence between their vows, building an agonizing anticipation for the moment Tyler Morris would finally orchestrate his own public ruin. The late afternoon sun baked the manicured lawns of the Lexington estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the 300 white folding chairs. The air was unseasonably still, heavy with humidity and the overpowering fragrance of hundreds of white gardenias I had woven into the ceremonial archway. To the untrained eye, the scene was a masterpiece of Southern elegance. Women in pastel silk dresses fanned themselves with printed programs, while men in tailored linen suits murmured polite, low-stakes conversations about golf handicaps and real estate investments. But standing in the lineup of bridesmaids, I felt the suffocating weight of the charade pressing down on my chest. Every detail of this beautiful, expensive afternoon was a lie. The string quartet, playing a soft, melancholic rendition of a classical sonata, was entirely funded by my mother's felony. The custom silk runner stretching down the aisle was bought with the money Tyler had siphoned from Lauren's accounts. The rot was everywhere, disguised by imported lace and forced smiles. I watched Tyler standing at the altar. He was a portrait of manufactured confidence. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his posture relaxed and commanding. He stood with his hands clasped casually in front of him, surveying the crowd with the smug satisfaction of a conqueror surveying his new kingdom. He believed he had won. He believed his brutal extortion of my mother had successfully secured the $250,000 trust fund, guaranteeing his down payment on the estate and solidifying his position among the Kentucky elite. He occasionally glanced toward the front row, where my parents were seated. Richard sat stiffly, his eyes fixed firmly straight ahead, avoiding any eye contact with his son. Diane, however, was a wreck, disguised in silver chiffon. She sat with her hands clamped together in her lap, her knuckles white. She offered a tight, trembling smile every time Tyler looked her way, desperate to project the image of the proud matriarch. Tyler fed on her fear. His smile widened, a silent, arrogant acknowledgement of his absolute control over her. Then the music swelled, transitioning into the bridal march. The collective murmur of the crowd fell away into an expectant hush. Lauren appeared at the top of the aisle, escorted by her father, a formidable man with a stern jawline and a reputation for ruthless corporate takeovers. The audience let out a collective, appreciative gasp. Lauren was breathtaking. Her ivory gown caught the golden sunlight, the intricate lace detailing shimmering with every deliberate step she took. I looked at her face as she walked down the aisle. She was the picture of bridal radiance, her expression serene and focused. But knowing what I knew, knowing the lethal trap she had helped me set, I saw the subtle, terrifying steel beneath her soft smile. She was walking toward a man she despised, a man who had stolen from her and tried to humiliate her family. She did not look like a woman walking to the altar. She looked like an executioner walking to the scaffold. Tyler watched her approach, his chest puffing out slightly. When LaRon's father handed her over, Tyler leaned in and kissed her cheek, murmuring something for the benefit of the front row guests. LaRon did not flinch. She smiled back, a flawless, camera-ready response, and turned to face the officiant. The ceremony began. The officiant, an older, distinguished man with a booming voice, spoke eloquently about the foundations of marriage. He spoke about trust, the importance of mutual respect, and the sacred bond of transparency between two partners. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt like a physical weight. Every word the officiant spoke was a direct indictment of the man standing opposite the bride. I watched Tyler's face as he recited his traditional vows. He delivered them with the practiced cadence of an actor performing a monologue he had rehearsed 1,000 times. "I promise to cherish you," he said, looking deeply into Lauren's eyes, his voice echoing over the silent crowd. "I promise to protect you and to build a legacy that honors both our families." The sheer audacity of his lies made my stomach turn. He was promising to build a legacy while actively plotting to steal my inheritance to cover his massive debts. He was promising to protect her while draining her bank accounts. He was a sociopath, completely detached from the reality of his own actions, driven only by his insatiable need for status. Lauren did not look away. She maintained absolute eye contact with him as she recited her own vows. Her voice was crystal clear, ringing out over the manicured lawn. "I promise to hold you accountable," she said. It was a slight deviation from the traditional script, a subtle alteration that went entirely unnoticed by the crowd, but hit me like a physical blow. "I promise to stand by the truth of our partnership and to ensure that our future is built on a foundation that can never be broken." Tyler smiled, likely assuming she was referencing his supposed entrepreneurial brilliance. He had no idea she was delivering his sentence. Every charming smile he offered, every confident nod he gave, was another nail being driven into his own coffin. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Tyler pulled Lauren into a dramatic, sweeping kiss, playing perfectly to the row of hired photographers stationed at the back of the seating area. As they turned to face the audience for the recessional, Tyler caught my eye again. He gave me that same subtle, arrogant nod he had offered before the ceremony. It was a reminder, a command. He was telling me that the performance was over and it was time for me to deliver the money. I offered a small, compliant nod in return. I needed him to stay complacent. I needed him to walk into the grand ballroom believing he was untouchable. The bridal party followed them back down the aisle, the string quartet playing a joyful, upbeat tempo. The guests began to stand, chatting excitedly as they made their way toward the terrace for cocktail hour. The transition from the tense ceremony to the celebratory reception was seamless. I slipped away from the other bridesmaids, weaving through the crowd to find my mother. I spotted Diane standing near the ice sculpture on the terrace, flanked by a group of her country club friends. She was holding a champagne flute, laughing a little too loudly at a joke someone had just told. The moment she saw me approaching, the forced laughter died in her throat. She quickly excused herself and grabbed my arm, pulling me behind a tall, decorative topiary. "Did you bring the papers?" Diane whispered urgently, her manicured fingers digging into my forearm. "The notary is waiting in the private dining room. Tyler wants the transfer executed before they open the ballroom doors for dinner." I looked at her terrified, frantic face. She was so desperate to escape the threat of federal prison, she was willing to drag me into the wreckage without a second thought. "I have the folder in my car." "Mom," I lied smoothly, keeping my voice calm and reassuring, "I will go get it right now. Just go inside, find your seat, and try to relax. It is handled." Diane let out a shaky sigh, releasing my arm. "Thank you, Chelsea," she breathed. Her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. "You are doing the right thing. This will save us all." She turned and hurried toward the entrance of the ballroom, her silver gown trailing behind her. I watched her go, feeling a complex mix of pity and profound anger. She truly believed that sacrificing my future would buy her peace. She did not realize that the peace she was buying was a complete illusion. And the real storm was about to break inside that ballroom. I did not go to my car. Instead, I walked through the service entrance, navigating the bustling kitchen corridors until I reached the back doors of the grand ballroom. The space was magnificent. The tables were set with flawless precision. Hundreds of candles flickered in the dim light, casting a warm glow over the crystal stemware. And right there, in the center of every single gold charger plate, rested the custom letterpress menu. The gold foil QR code caught the candlelight, gleaming like a tiny, perfectly primed explosive. The trap was fully armed. The guests were beginning to take their seats. The climax of Tyler's grand illusion was mere minutes away, and the tension in the air was absolute. The mahogany doors swung open. 300 guests filtered from the terrace into the grand ballroom. The transition marked the beginning of the end. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms glided across the imported marble floor, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The room smelled of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and the thousands of white gardenias I had suspended from the ceiling. Laughter and polite conversation echoed off the crystal chandeliers overhead. It was a picture of Kentucky high society at its finest, a gathering of old money and ruthless ambition. And sitting perfectly centered on every gold charger plate was the custom letterpress menu I had designed. The gold foil QR code caught the ambient light, glittering like a metallic promise against the dark ivory linen. I took my seat near the front of the room, placing my clutch on my lap. Across the ballroom, Diane was unraveling in plain sight. She paced a tight circle near the edge of the head table, her silver chiffon gown swishing against the floorboards. Every few seconds, her head snapped in my direction. She was waiting for the leather folder containing the trust transfer. She expected me to approach her, hand over my signature, and secure her freedom from a federal prison sentence. I caught her eye and gave a small, reassuring nod, tapping my clutch as if the legal papers were safely tucked inside. The relief that washed over her face was palpable. Her rigid shoulders dropped, and she quickly signaled a passing waiter for another glass of wine. She had spent decades cultivating a reputation as a flawless, untouchable matriarch, hosting charity galas and dominating country club committees. Tonight, she was nothing more than a terrified debtor waiting for a bailout, entirely unaware that the bailout was never coming. The 12-piece jazz band transitioned into an upbeat, triumphant tempo, signaling the arrival of the wedding party. The master of ceremonies took the microphone, his voice booming over the speakers, to announce the new couple. Tyler and Lauren stepped through the arched doorway. The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Tyler raised his hand, waving to the crowd with the polished charisma of a politician claiming victory on election night. He guided Lauren toward the head table, his chest puffed out, soaking in the admiration of the wealthy elite he had so desperately wanted to join. He looked at Lauren's father across the room, offering a confident salute, firmly believing he had secured his permanent place in their bourbon empire. Lauren walked beside him, her posture rigid and perfect. She did not wave. She offered a tight, polite smile to the clapping guests, but her eyes remained cold and focused on the center of the room. Tyler leaned in to whisper something in her ear, likely another congratulatory remark about their flawless presentation. Lauren simply nodded, keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead. Tyler mistook her icy composure for aristocratic grace. He lacked the basic emotional intelligence to recognize that the woman standing next to him was not basking in the glow of new love. She was preparing for a public execution. The guests settled into their seats, the initial excitement giving way to the clinking of silverware and low murmurs of conversation. The first course was served. I watched Tyler pick up his fork, eating with the relaxed appetite of a man who had no burdens left in the world. He had bullied his mother, intimidated his sister, and married a fortune. In his mind, he had crossed the finish line. He picked up his champagne flute, tapping a silver spoon against the crystal rim. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the chatter, commanding the attention of every person in the room. The ballroom fell silent. Tyler stood up, buttoning his tailored tuxedo jacket, and grabbed the microphone from the polished stand. He looked out over the sea of faces, his signature brilliant smile securely in place. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. His tone held the cadence of a man delivering a keynote address rather than a wedding toast. Looking around this room, I see family, friends, and the esteemed leaders of our community. I see people who understand what it takes to build something meaningful. I felt my stomach tighten at his profound hypocrisy. My father, Richard, sat 2 tables away, nodding along with blind pride. Tyler paced slightly behind the head table, holding the microphone close. Lauren and I come from different backgrounds, he continued, pausing for dramatic effect. Her family built a legendary brand over generations. My family taught me the value of creating an empire from the ground up. He looked directly at my parents. He was weaponizing the myth of the self-made man, erasing the stolen equity, the fraudulent mortgage, and the extortion that actually funded his lifestyle. He was painting himself as a visionary who conquered obstacles through sheer willpower. I learned early on that success requires bold moves, Tyler said, his gaze sweeping over Lauren's family table. It requires taking risks, securing the right capital, and never backing down from a challenge. When I met Lauren, I knew I had found a partner who matched my ambition. A woman who demands excellence, transparency, and loyalty. I looked at Lauren. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The glacial ice in her eyes was unmistakable now, a freezing stare directed straight at the man holding the microphone. Tyler was oblivious to the lethal energy radiating from his bride. He was too caught up in the sound of his own voice, too drunk on the illusion of his own grandeur, to notice that the ground beneath him was crumbling. Tyler turned toward me, offering a wide, magnanimous grin. I also want to thank my sister, Chelsea. She provided the floral arrangements tonight. She is learning the ropes of the event business, and Lauren and I wanted to give her a chance to shine on a larger stage. Family supports family. After all. A polite ripple of applause echoed through the room. I kept my face neutral, absorbing the condescension without blinking. He was using his final moments of perceived power to belittle me one last time, ensuring everyone knew he was the benevolent, successful older brother. He turned back to the center of the room, raising his champagne flute high into the air. The spotlight caught the crystal, sending fractured rays of light across the ceiling. But enough about the past, Tyler announced, his voice rising in triumphant crescendo. Tonight is about the future. It is about the legacy Lauren and I are building together. And to commemorate the start of this journey, we have prepared a special presentation for all of you. He gestured grandly toward the tables. You'll notice a custom menu at your setting, complete with a gold foil square at the bottom. My beautiful bride and I want to share a digital tribute with you, a look back at our relationship and the foundation of our new empire. I invite everyone to take out your phones right now. Please scan the QR codes on your tables to share in our journey. The 12-piece jazz band stopped playing entirely, allowing a dramatic, expectant silence to fill the grand ballroom. 300 of Kentucky's elite citizens reached into their suit pockets and designer clutches. I watched my mother fumble for her phone, eager to witness the romantic montage her golden son had promised. I watched Lauren's father adjust his reading glasses, holding his device over the gold foil stamp. And I watched Tyler stand at the head table, his glass still raised, waiting for the applause and adoration he believed he was owed. He had set the stage perfectly. He had demanded the attention of every single person in the room. He had literally handed them the weapon. And now, all he could do was watch as they pulled the trigger. The blue light from 300 smartphone screens illuminated the dim ballroom. It was a surreal, glowing wave that washed over the seated guests. A chorus of electronic chimes echoed through the cavernous space as cameras locked onto the gold foil squares printed on the menus. The wealthy elite of Kentucky leaned over their tables, their faces bathed in the soft luminescence of their devices. Tyler stood at the head table. He held his crystal flute high in the air. His teeth gleamed in the candlelight. He waited for the swelling strings of a romantic pop ballad. He waited for the collective, admiring sighs of the audience. He shifted his weight, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. ready to absorb the adoration he believed he had rightfully earned. But the music never came. Instead, a profound, heavy confusion settled over the room. I watched Lauren's father tap his screen with a thick finger. His silver eyebrows drew together in a tight, confused frown. I saw my mother bring her device closer to her face, her eyes narrowing as she tried to comprehend the display. The landing page did not feature a slideshow of engagement photos. It did not display a timeline of a fairy tale romance. It was a stark, clinical, white screen. The bold black text at the top read, "The Truth About Tyler Morris." Below the heading was a simple audio player and a link to a PDF document titled Forged Mortgage Records. Then, the audio began. It did not start from the main speakers. It started as a scattered, chaotic chorus originating from the tables themselves. One phone played the file, then 10, then 50. Within seconds, the harsh, grainy recording I had captured outside my father's study flooded the elegant ballroom. The acoustics of the venue amplified the noise, turning the individual speakers into a suffocating, inescapable wall of sound. "You promised me the catering check would clear by Friday." Tyler's voice hissed from hundreds of tiny speakers. It was devoid of the manufactured charm he had just used during his toast. It was cruel, impatient, and dripping with entitlement. The guests froze. Silverware clattered against fine china plates. A waiter standing near the service doors stopped dead in his tracks, a tray of champagne hovering forgotten in his hands. "I cannot pull blood from a stone, Tyler." My mother's desperate, weeping voice answered him on the recording. The high society crowd heard the matriarch they admired begging her own son for mercy. The juxtaposition was jarring. Here was Diane, sitting at the head table in a silver chiffon designer gown, while her digital voice sobbed about maxed-out credit cards and hidden debts. I looked at the head table. The triumphant smile had slid off Tyler's face, leaving behind a slack, vacant expression. His brain was struggling to process the reality unfolding around him. He looked down at his own phone resting near his dinner plate. The stark white screen stared back at him. "There is $250,000 sitting in a local branch right now." The digital Tyler sneered, his tone echoing off the marble floors. "Chelsea does not need that kind of capital to arrange tulips. I need it for the down payment on the estate." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. The illusion of the self-made entrepreneur evaporated in an instant. They were listening to a parasite plotting to steal his sister's inheritance. My father, Richard, dropped his cloth napkin. He turned his head slowly, staring at his wife. For decades, he had chosen willful ignorance. He had ignored the missing funds and the mounting tension in his home. Now, the truth was being broadcast to every person he respected. There was nowhere left to hide. The recording reached its devastating, lethal climax. "You forged a dying man's signature, secured a fraudulent notary, and wired the funds across state lines to my corporate account. You committed the felony." Diane let out a sharp, strangled sound. It was the noise of a woman realizing her life was over. She dropped her device. It hit the table with a loud clack. She pressed both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so deep it made her tremble. The secret she had sold her soul to protect, the federal crime she had committed to fund her golden child, was now public knowledge. The judges seated at table 4 knew. The real estate magnates at table 7 knew. Her country club peers were listening to her crimes. Across the room, Lauren's father stood up. His chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched collar. He glared at Tyler with a look of pure, unadulterated rage. He was a man who destroyed corporate rivals without hesitation, and he had just realized a petty con artist had infiltrated his family and attempted to steal his daughter's wealth. The digital voice delivered the final, crushing blow. "If you do not break Chelsea's trust and transfer her funds to me, I will burn your life to the ground, and I am draining the joint accounts anyway." Lauren's family has enough liquidity to cover the gaps. The champagne flute slipped from Tyler's hand. Time seemed to slow down as the fragile crystal tumbled through the air. It struck the edge of the head table, bounced once, and plummeted to the marble floor. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The sharp, piercing sound of the impact echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. It was the physical manifestation of his empire collapsing. The golden facade fractured and splintered, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. The audio files reached their end, fading out one by one across the room. The ballroom descended into a deafening, suffocating silence. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The jazz band members stood frozen on their elevated stage, their brass instruments hanging uselessly at their sides. The only sound was the faint, ragged breathing of my mother weeping into her hands. The guests seated at the tables closest to the front began to whisper. The sound was low and frantic, a buzzing hive of scandal and outrage. Women in designer gowns covered their mouths, casting disgusted glances at the head table. Men tightened their jaws, pulling their wives closer, physically distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout radiating from the Morris family. Tyler's breathing grew shallow and rapid. His chest heaved beneath his crisp white shirt. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard, his knuckles mirrored my mother's from earlier in the dressing room. He was experiencing the exact terror he had inflicted upon us. The public humiliation he had threatened to unleash upon my floral business was now raining down upon his own head, magnified 100 times over. Lauren's mother, seated near the dance floor, pressed a napkin to her chest, her face pale with shock. She looked at her daughter, expecting to see a weeping, devastated girl. Instead, she saw a warrior. Lauren slowly turned her head, meeting her mother's gaze, and gave a faint, reassuring nod. It was a silent confirmation. The bride was not a victim. The bride was the architect. I watched my father bury his face in his hands. Richard could no longer pretend. He could no longer hide behind his newspaper or his quiet retreats to the study. His legacy, his name, his marriage were all publicly dismantled in less than 3 minutes. The truth he had spent years running away from had finally caught up to him, and it brought a relentless, unforgiving spotlight. Tyler stood at the podium, completely paralyzed. The tailored tuxedo now looked like a costume he had stolen. The charismatic confidence was gone, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed stare of a cornered thief caught in the snare. He was naked to the world. He looked at the shattered glass at his feet, then slowly lifted his head. He looked at Lauren. She sat beside him, casually sipping her ice water. Her posture remained flawless. Her expression was serene and glacial. She did not look like a heartbroken bride. She looked like a queen who had just ordered an execution. Then, Tyler turned his gaze toward the back of the room. His eyes searched the crowd until they locked onto me. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I felt no remorse. I felt no pity. I felt a cold, purifying clarity. The tumor had been excised in broad daylight. He had threatened my livelihood, extorted our mother, and attempted to steal the shield my grandfather had built for me. He believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed we were merely stepping stones on his path to greatness. I held his gaze, offering a single, slow blink. The air in the ballroom grew thick, heavy with the stench of exposed secrets and shattered egos. The beautiful floral arrangements hanging above our heads felt like funeral wreaths, marking the demise of a family built on deception. Tyler took a step back from the podium, his foot crunching against a shard of the broken champagne flute. The grinding sound of the crystal under his polished leather shoe broke the spell of silence, signaling the start of the chaotic, inevitable aftermath. The crunch of shattered crystal under my brother's polished leather shoe broke the paralyzing spell holding the ballroom hostage. Tyler snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He lunged across the head table, his hands scrambling and slipping on the smooth mahogany surface as he grabbed the microphone stand. A loud, piercing screech of audio feedback echoed through the speakers, causing several guests in the front row to cover their ears. "Turn it off," Tyler screamed, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch that instantly stripped away his carefully cultivated aura of control. He ripped the microphone from its cradle, pacing frantically behind the table. He pointed a shaking finger at the center of the room, addressing the sea of glowing smartphone screens. "It is a hoax," he shouted, his chest heaving. "It is a deep fake. Someone used artificial intelligence to manipulate my voice. This is a coordinated attack. It is corporate espionage by a rival software firm trying to tank my next launch. Do not listen to it. Put your phones away." He waited for the reassurance he was so used to receiving. He waited for the wealthy elite to nod in sympathetic agreement, to offer him the benefit of the doubt, to coddle him the way our mother had done his entire life. Nobody moved. The elite citizens of Lexington were not fools. They had just heard the raw, unedited terror in Diane's weeping voice. They had heard the highly specific, damning financial details about local bank branches, estate deposits, and a dying man's hospice bed. A random corporate rival would not know the intimate, sickening mechanics of our family dynamics. The silence in the venue morphed from initial shock into a palpable, suffocating disgust. Tyler looked out at the faces of the judges, the investors, and the real estate developers he had courted all evening. He saw their narrowed eyes and curled lips. The grand illusion was dead. Then, Lauren moved. She did not flinch, weep, or scream. She did not ask him for an explanation. She reached across the white linen tablecloth, her manicured fingers wrapping deliberately around the stem of her untouched champagne flute. She stood up. The rustle of her heavy ivory gown drew the attention of every single person in the room, pulling their gaze away from the unraveling groom and fixing it upon the bride. Tyler stopped his frantic pacing. He turned to her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The feral panic in his eyes shifted into a pathetic, pleading desperation. He reached his free hand toward her, the microphone dangling uselessly in his other grip. "Lauren, baby, you have to believe me," he begged, his voice dropping to a loud, carrying whisper. "It is a setup. Someone is trying to ruin us." Lauren lifted the crystal flute to her lips. She took a slow, measured sip of the expensive champagne. It was a calculated, deliberate gesture of total disrespect, a physical demonstration that he was not worth a single tear or a raised voice. She swallowed, lowered the glass to the table, and met his gaze with the warmth of a winter blizzard. "The annulment papers will be filed on Monday morning," she stated. Her tone was not loud, but the flawless acoustics of the silent venue carried every crisp syllable to the furthest corners of the room. She spoke to him the way one might address a stain on the bottom of a shoe. "Do not ever contact me," she continued, her eyes locking onto his, "or my family again." Tyler dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. "Lauren, wait, please." Before his hand could even brush the delicate lace of her sleeve, a wall of broad shoulders and dark worsted wool materialized between them. Lauren's father and her two older brothers stepped onto the elevated platform, positioning themselves directly in front of the bride. The patriarch of the Bourbon Empire did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He leaned in close, invading my brother's personal space. "If you so much as breathe in her direction," the older man murmured, delivering a promise of total corporate and personal annihilation, "I will make sure you spend the remainder of your pathetic life rotting in a federal penitentiary." Tyler shrank back, his bravado crumbling into dust under the sheer, terrifying weight of the older man's authority. Lauren turned her back on her husband. She picked up the train of her gown and walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. Her head was held high, her spine forged from unyielding steel. She did not look like a humiliated woman fleeing a ruined wedding day. She looked like a commanding general walking away from a conquered battlefield, leaving the casualties behind in the dirt. Her family flanked her, a formidable, silent escort marching steadily out of the grand double doors. The towering mahogany doors swung shut behind them with a resounding, final thud. Tyler watched his future, his access to generational wealth, and his elite status vanish behind that closed wood. The reality of his absolute ruin crashed down upon him. The desperate, pleading facade melted away in an instant, leaving only a raw, venomous rage. His head snapped around, his wild eyes scanning the dimly lit room. He looked at the tables. He looked at the custom menus resting on the charger plates. He connected the dots. I was the event designer. I handled the printing. I controlled the visual flow of the evening. His eyes locked onto me, sitting calmly at a table near the front. "You did this," he snarled. The accusation ripped from his throat, a guttural sound of pure hatred. "You ruined my life." He jumped down from the elevated stage. His polished leather shoes hit the marble floor, and he charged. He did not care about the hundreds of witnesses watching him. He did not care about preserving whatever shredded dignity he had left. He was a cornered predator, stripped of his prize, and he wanted to inflict physical pain on the person who sprang the trap. I remained seated at my table. I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not raise my hands to defend myself or cry out for help. I simply watched the monster reveal his true, violent nature to the world. He never made it to my table. 3 of his own groomsmen intervened. These were men he had personally recruited to stand beside him, former college roommates and fraternity brothers who had just listened to an audio recording of him bragging about draining his bride's bank accounts and extorting his mother. They intercepted his violent charge with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. One man grabbed Tyler by the shoulder, spinning him around before he could reach me. Tyler swung a wild, uncoordinated fist, clipping the groomsman on the jaw. That was his final, fatal mistake. The physical strike broke whatever lingering sense of loyalty or confusion those men held. They swarmed him. A flurry of dark suits and limbs tangled on the polished floorboards. The groomsmen tackled my brother to the ground, pinning him flat against the hard marble. The sound of tearing fabric echoed near my table. Tyler's expensive, tailored jacket ripped along the shoulder seam. His silk bow tie tore away, dangling uselessly from his starched collar. He thrashed and kicked, screaming incoherent insults, his face turning a deep, mottled purple with rage and physical exertion. "Hold him down," someone shouted over the commotion. "Do not let him up." The wealthy guests watched the struggle in horrified fascination. The self-proclaimed visionary entrepreneur was writhing on the ground like a petulant, violent child having a tantrum. The grand illusion was dismantled, piece by piece, right in front of their eyes. The room no longer saw a brilliant chief executive officer or a charming Southern gentleman. They saw a parasite, a desperate fraud who had tried to build an empire on the broken backs of the women in his life, and through a fistfight when his theft was exposed. Waitstaff backed against the floral-covered walls, unsure of how to navigate the chaos. A few guests pulled out their smartphones, no longer scanning the QR codes on the menus, but dialing emergency services or recording the complete unhinging of the Golden Child. I looked down at the man pinned to the floor. The suffocating fear that had dictated my entire adult life, the constant, low-level anxiety of living under his financial shadow, evaporated entirely. I felt light. I felt free. The boogeyman of my childhood was just a pathetic bully with a torn jacket, struggling against the very friends he had lied to. But as the groomsmen hauled a still shouting, thrashing Tyler toward the service exit to remove him from the venue, my gaze shifted away from the spectacle. The chaotic noise of my brother's physical takedown had briefly drawn the attention away from the other major casualty of the evening. The architect of my childhood misery was still inside the ballroom, and her reckoning was just beginning. The heavy service doors swung shut, cutting off the muffled sound of my brother shouting as the groomsmen hauled him down the back corridor. The sudden absence of his frantic, thrashing energy left a profound vacuum in the center of the grand ballroom. The physical altercation was over, but the structural damage to the Morris family was permanent. The pristine illusion we had maintained for decades lay scattered across the marble floor alongside the shards of broken crystal. The guests did not linger. The wealthy elite of Lexington possessed a primal instinct for avoiding public scandal. They moved with a hurried, synchronized precision. Chairs scraped harshly against the floorboards as judges, investors, and socialites gathered their silk wraps and designer clutches. No one offered their goodbyes. No one stopped to offer sympathies to my parents. They simply flowed toward the main exits in a quiet, urgent tide, desperate to distance their own reputations from the radioactive fallout radiating from the head table. I remained standing near the front of the room, watching the mass exodus. I did not feel a sense of triumphant victory. The adrenaline that had fueled my actions over the past few weeks was draining away, leaving behind a hollow, chilling clarity. I turned my attention away from the fleeing guests and looked toward the elevated platform. Diane was still sitting in her chair. The regal, intimidating matriarch who had pinned me against a vanity just hours earlier was gone. In her place sat a frail, terrified woman, rapidly unraveling under the harsh glow of the chandeliers. She slumped forward, her elbows resting on the white linen tablecloth. She buried her face in her trembling hands. The silver chiffon designer gown, which she had worn like a coat of armor throughout the ceremony, now pooled around her chair like melted lead. It looked heavy, dragging her down into the wreckage of her own making. Her meticulously pinned hair had fallen loose, thin strands hanging limp around her face. I navigated the maze of abandoned dinner tables, my heels clicking softly against the marble. A few lingering waitstaff watched me with wide, hesitant eyes, but they quickly stepped out of my path. I walked up the short flight of stairs to the head table. Diane heard my footsteps, her breath caught in her throat. She slowly lowered her hands, revealing a face ravaged by ruined cosmetics and deep, suffocating despair. Dark streaks of mascara stained her cheeks. The expensive foundation could not hide the pale, ashen tone of her skin. She looked up at me, her shoulders stiffening as she braced herself for the incoming blow. She expected me to yell. She expected me to gloat over her downfall, to remind her of every cruel comment, every financial manipulation, and every time she had sacrificed my well-being to protect her golden child. She waited for the crushing weight of my righteous anger. I stopped a few feet away from her chair. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like a disposable asset. I saw the pure, unfiltered terror in her eyes. The secret she had sold her soul to bury, the felony she had committed while her own father lay in a hospice bed, was now a matter of public record. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer her a cruel smile. "He cannot hurt you anymore." "Mom," I said. My voice was soft, steady, and devoid of any malice. "But I cannot save you from what you did." The words struck her harder than any screamed insult ever could. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her lower lashes. Her lower lip trembled, and she let out a broken, jagged sob that seemed to tear its way out of her chest. She understood the profound, tragic paradox of the trap I had set. By exposing Tyler's extortion to the entire room, I had effectively neutralized his power over her. He could no longer hold the forged mortgage documents over her head. He could no longer threaten to ruin her social standing, because her social standing was already reduced to ashes. The relentless, agonizing pressure of funding his lavish lifestyle was instantly eradicated. She was finally free from the crushing weight of her son's blackmail. But that freedom came at the ultimate price. The shield was gone, leaving her fully exposed to the legal consequences of her own initial crime. She had sacrificed her morals, betrayed her dying father, and alienated her only loyal daughter, all to build a protective fortress around a boy who ultimately used that same fortress as a prison to keep her trapped. Diane reached out a shaking hand, her fingers hovering inches from my arm. She wanted comfort. She wanted the unconditional forgiveness she had never earned. She opened her mouth, struggling to form a coherent sentence through her ragged breathing. "Chelsea," she whispered, the sound cracking halfway through my name. "I am so sorry. I was so afraid." I did not step away, but I did not reach out to take her hand either. I simply stood there, allowing the cold reality of her choices to settle between us. "Fear does not justify what you tried to do to me in that dressing room," I replied gently. "You chose to break the law, and then you chose to break me to hide it." Her hand fell back to her lap, resting uselessly against the silver chiffon. The last remaining embers of her denial extinguished. She closed her eyes, bowing her head in total surrender to the fate she had engineered. A shadow fell across the table. I turned my head and saw my father, Richard, standing near the edge of the elevated platform. Richard looked like a man who had aged a decade in the span of an hour. His classic black tuxedo hung loosely on his frame. The willful ignorance he had cultivated for 30 years was brutally stripped away, leaving him to face the ugly, undeniable truth about his marriage. He stared at Diane. There was no sympathy in his gaze. There was no instinct to comfort his weeping wife. I saw only a profound, chilling revulsion. "Richard," Diane gasped, sensing his presence. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and pleading. "Richard, please." He did not answer her. He looked at the shattered champagne flute on the floor, then at the empty chairs where the wealthy guests had been sitting moments before. He realized the Morris name was permanently disgraced. His quiet, comfortable life was over, destroyed by the criminal actions of the woman sitting in front of him. Richard turned on his heel. He walked down the steps and headed toward the side exit, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He did not look back. He abandoned her there in the ruins of the reception, securing his own distance from the impending legal storm. Diane let out a low, mourning wail as the side door clicked shut behind him. She was entirely alone. The friends she had spent years impressing had fled. The husband she had lied to had walked away, and the son she had committed wire fraud to protect had been dragged out by his own groomsmen. I looked around the cavernous ballroom. The floral arrangements I had spent months designing still hung beautifully from the ceilings, a stark contrast to the human wreckage scattered below them. The silence in the venue was absolute, save for the faint sounds of the waitstaff clearing plates in the far corners of the room. The emotional climax had peaked, leaving a sterile, practical reality in its wake. The social execution was finished, but the legal machinery was just beginning to turn. The audio recording had been broadcast. The digital documents had been downloaded by dozens of influential citizens before they fled the venue. The truth was out in the open, and the truth demanded official consequences. A loud, decisive thud echoed from the back of the ballroom. The ornate main doors swung open once again. The few remaining venue staff members stopped their clearing duties, turning their heads toward the entrance. I looked past my weeping mother, my eyes locking onto the figure standing in the doorway. It was not a straggling guest returning for a forgotten coat. It was a tall, imposing man carrying a battered leather briefcase, radiating a stern, unyielding authority that commanded the attention of the entire room. The final piece of the trap had arrived to finish the job. Gregory Sterling stood framed in the entryway. He wore his customary charcoal pinstripe suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture rigid and unyielding. In his right hand, he gripped a battered leather briefcase that had carried the secrets of Kentucky elite for over 4 decades. He stepped over the threshold. His leather shoes clicked against the marble floor in a slow, rhythmic cadence that echoed through the vast, empty ballroom. The few remaining venue employees shrank back into the shadows, instinctively recognizing the arrival of severe, unbending authority. Gregory did not glance at the overturned chairs or the abandoned plates of expensive food. He did not look at my weeping mother slumped in her chair at the head table. His piercing gaze was fixed entirely on the far corner of the room near the service corridor, where 3 exhausted groomsmen were still pinning my brother against the floral wallpaper. Tyler looked pathetic. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was torn at the shoulder seam, the expensive fabric hanging in jagged threads. His silk bow tie was gone. His crisp white shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he searched for an escape route that did not exist. When the groomsmen saw Gregory approaching, they exchanged nervous glances. They were young men from wealthy families, accustomed to privilege, but they recognized a seasoned litigator when they saw one. Without waiting for a command, they released their grip on Tyler and stepped away, putting immediate distance between themselves and their former friend. Tyler stumbled forward, catching himself against the wall. He dragged a trembling hand through his disheveled hair, trying to straighten his spine. He attempted to pull the torn edges of his jacket together, a futile gesture to reclaim his shattered dignity. He lifted his chin, forcing a hollow, terrified sneer onto his face as the attorney stopped 3 feet away. "You have no right to be here," Tyler spat. His voice was hoarse, lacking the polished resonance he had used during his toast. "This is a private event. I am calling security. I am suing you, Chelsea, and whatever amateur hacker doctored that audio file." Gregory did not blink. He stood perfectly still, studying Tyler with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing an insect under glass. For 30 years, Gregory had served as the personal counsel to Grandfather Thomas. He had sat in dusty farmhouses and sterile bank vaults, watching Thomas build an empire from raw timber and stubborn grit. Gregory respected hard work, and he harbored a deep, enduring contempt for the heirs who tried to harvest the fruit without ever planting a seed. He had watched Tyler burn through startup capital, manipulate Diane, and sneer at honest labor. Today was not just a professional obligation for the attorney. It was a profound, personal reckoning. "You are not calling security, Tyler," Gregory said. His voice was quiet, yet it carried a lethal, chilling weight. "And you are not suing anyone. You are going to stand there and listen, because your window for negotiation closed the moment you threatened to send your own mother to a federal penitentiary." Tyler opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the leather briefcase. Gregory rested the case on a nearby cocktail table. He unlatched the brass clasps with 2 sharp clicks. He reached inside and withdrew a thick manila envelope, the edges sealed with red wax. He held it out. Tyler stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled, venomous snake. He pressed his back tighter against the wall, refusing to raise his hands. "Take it," Gregory commanded, his tone dropping an octave. Tyler shook his head, his breathing growing shallow. "If I do not accept it, you cannot serve me." Gregory let out a dry, humorless breath. He opened his fingers, letting the heavy envelope fall. It struck the marble floor right at Tyler's expensive leather shoes, landing with a definitive, heavy slap. "Consider yourself served," Gregory stated smoothly. "That is a formal notice of intent to sue, filed 30 minutes ago on behalf of Lauren's Family Trust." Tyler's eyes widened. He looked from the envelope to the attorney, his face draining of all remaining color. Lauren's family. Her father retains the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state. Gregory explained, his words striking like precise hammer blows. "They conducted a preliminary audit of your joint accounts this afternoon. They documented the unauthorized transfers, the falsified vendor invoices, and the capital you diverted into your private holding companies. You did not just borrow money from your bride, Tyler. You embezzled it." "No," Tyler stammered, his hands shaking wildly. "No, she authorized those transfers. We were buying real estate. We were investing." "You were covering your debts," Gregory corrected. And because you used wire transfers to move her trust funds across state lines to pay off your offshore creditors, it elevates the civil matter to a federal jurisdiction. Her family is seeking full restitution, punitive damages, and immediate asset freezing. By tomorrow morning, every bank account bearing your name will be locked. You will not be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a defense attorney. Tyler's knees buckled slightly. He slid down the wall, his back scraping against the expensive wallpaper until he hit the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest, staring at the manila envelope resting by his shoes. The realization of his financial doom was crashing over him in relentless, suffocating waves. He had tried to steal my inheritance to plug the holes in his sinking ship. Now, the ship was entirely submerged, and the anchor was tied around his neck. But Gregory was not finished. Furthermore, the older man continued, retrieving a second, thinner envelope from his briefcase. This pertains to the audio recording broadcast in this room 10 minutes ago. Tyler flinched, burying his face in his hands. As an officer of the court, Gregory said, his voice ringing with unyielding duty, I have a legal obligation to report evidence of severe criminal activity. A digital copy of your extortion attempt, along with the preliminary records of the fraudulent second mortgage you forced your mother to secure, was hand-delivered to the district attorney's office prior to my arrival here. Diane, who was still slumped at the head table across the room, let out a sharp, wounded gasp. Tyler lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with panicked tears. You cannot do that, he whimpered. You represent our family. You represent my grandfather. I represent the estate of Thomas Morris, Gregory corrected sharply, and you are a threat to that estate. You weaponized a felony to extort a frightened woman. The district attorney is opening a formal investigation into the mortgage fraud tomorrow. They will pull the bank records. They will interview the notary. Your mother will have to answer for her initial crime. But you, Tyler, will face charges for blackmail and coercion. The magnitude of the legal strike was staggering. Tyler was surrounded on all sides. Lauren's family was coming for his non-existent wealth in civil court. The state prosecutors were coming for his freedom in criminal court. He had no allies left. The fraternity brothers who had tackled him were already walking out the service doors, eager to distance themselves from a prime suspect. Tyler looked desperately across the empty, cavernous ballroom. His gaze bypassed the shattered crystal and the abandoned plates. He looked at Diane. "Mom," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, childlike plea. "Mom, you have to help me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you offered me the money." Diane did not move. She sat frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the tablecloth. The spell was broken. The golden child was dead, replaced by the monster she had built. She had nothing left to give him. Her credit was ruined, her reputation was ashes, and she was facing her own looming legal nightmare. She slowly turned her head away from him, closing her eyes and shutting him out forever. Tyler let out a ragged, agonizing sob. He turned his desperate gaze toward me. "Chelsea," he wept, crawling a few inches forward on the marble floor. "Chelsea, please. You have the trust fund. You can hire the lawyers. You can fix this. I am your brother." I stood up from my table. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, my movements calm and deliberate. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the floor. I remembered the years of subtle insults. I remembered him demanding I surrender my future to fund his lies. I remembered the cold, terrifying voice on the recording, threatening to send our mother to a federal cell just so he could secure a down payment on a mansion. "I owe you nothing," I said. My voice was quiet, but it echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. It was the final, definitive boundary. I turned my back on him, I picked up my clutch, and walked toward the main exit, leaving him kneeling in the ruins of his own making, stripped of his bride, his family, and his freedom, with the heavy weight of the law sitting in a manila envelope right at his feet.